What we'll do is we'll go straight into the conversation. So we'll start with the co-author of the report, Professor Paul Cheshire. So if you want to introduce the report that has been published today by Bright Blue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks for inviting. Thanks for commissioning the report, because I think it's a very important issue. Now, whether a tax is a good or a bad tax doesn't depend only on whether rich people pay more or less than poorer people, but of course that is one important factor. What matters, however, from a distributional point of view, is really how the tax system works overall, whether in the end the welfare system, the combination of the welfare system and the tax system means that there's a redistribution in favour of poorer people. So, you know, the fact is that the stamp duty is a truly terrible tax, but it isn't regressive. Because it rises with house values, people in richer houses and areas where houses are more expensive pay more stamp duty than poorer people do. But it's still a really awful tax, and we strongly recommend it should be abolished and replaced. Now, council tax is also a terrible tax. It is regressive. Poorer people pay on a bit more, tend to pay more than richer people. But it's also just a terrible mess, because it was introduced in a hurry in the wake of the poll tax fiasco. It doesn't pay for local services. It's not a charge for local services. It's not a tax on housing, because there's all sorts of loopholes in it. And it's also regressive. So it's charged on the hypothetical value of a house in 1991. Even if the house was built in 2015, we still imagine what its value would have been. Now, if you go back, if you look at the data, which I've been doing in great detail, houses in many prosperous parts of London have increased in value since 1991 tenfold. On the other hand, houses in several northern towns have only increased 2.5, 3 times. So that's produced huge inequities. Or, you know, you're a single man, and I'm using that term intentionally. You're a single man living in quite a large house in a prosperous borough of London. It's quite likely you're paying less council tax than a family of 2 living in a 2-bedroom flat next door. And indeed, if it's your second home, if the man's living in his second home in London, he'll be paying much less council tax because there's a discount for second homes. So in our report, we've tried to look at the system as a whole. We've tried to make recommendations for the system as a whole, not in a sort of narrow way. Now, local property taxes, both historically and for good rational reasons, have provided the basis for funding local government. They've done that in Britain historically. They do it in many countries around the world. But in England, indeed in Britain, we've increasingly departed from that pattern, that blueprint. Because if local authorities raise more tax from council tax, they are likely to lose revenue from the Treasury. So there's a clawback involved. And one result is, over time, we've tended to convert local government into essentially an agent of national government. We've created a system where there are actually strong incentives for local government to resist new homes in their area, because they have to pay for the services of the additional residents, but they don't get any revenue necessarily to help fund that. So this fuels NIMBYism. If you're serious about local democracy, then I think you need to have a measure of local fiscal autonomy. Local communities need to be in charge of their own lives to some extent, and that requires that they have some control over their finances. But equally, if you're serious about net zero, you need to build more houses, because new houses are so much more energy efficient than old houses. So our package of reform tries to address all these issues. We suggest there should be a clear division of responsibility between nationally funded local services, where we expect there to be a national quality of provision, education, health, social care, things like that. So even if local government is the agent of delivery, it should be funded out of national taxation. And then to have a clear division of what are local services, where local communities should be in a position to judge what suits their residents best and to raise the revenue to pay for them. So what we suggest is that you have an average proportional tax on current house values, an APPT. We suggest various ways in which the shock of that introduction should be mitigated, include phasing it in, including protecting the income poor but the property rich from the shock of having suddenly to pay a lot more tax. Now, a small fraction of this APPT should be to replace to the Treasury the revenues lost from abolishing stamp duty, because stamp duty stops people moving to houses that better suit them. It stops older people from downsizing to release more housing space and use it more effectively. Now, giving local autonomy in setting the rates to local authorities means that we cannot be sure whether the net effect of our changes would be progressive or regressive. But we've done a lot of simulations, and on balance, it looks as if they will be progressive. But much more importantly than that, there would be a package that makes sense and encourages people to behave in ways that are more efficient. So we also add an infrastructure levy. So a proportion of the value of all new houses built should be paid specific, and the funding revenue from that should be specifically devoted to paying for the extra infrastructure and public services to accommodate the new residents and to fund social housing. And then we can get rid of two more terrible taxes, which are Section 106 agreements and CIL, community infrastructure levies. And then we should add to that something which I think is really important and has been neglected. We call it green offsets. That is the proportion of the APPT which local residents pay should be discounted by the energy performance certificates of their houses. At the moment, we have a very complex system of energy performance certificates for houses, but we don't do anything with it except provide information. Now, how the carbon emissions from the residential sector have increased consistently over the last 30 years. They now account for nearly 20% of all our carbon releases. So it's really important that we tackle that problem. So taken together, our packages, we think, our package of reforms would be fairer, it would be much more transparent, it would make common sense, people could see what they were paying and why they were paying it, and it would generate a systematic set of incentives to both encourage local home building and encourage more new houses which are more energy efficient, and encourage people to invest in more insulation and other mitigation of carbon release in their houses. So that's our package, Ryan. I offer it to you.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I'm back now, and the technical problems are sorted, so I apologise for that. But Paul, you steered the ship very well there, so thank you. And it was a pleasure working with you on this report. Paul is a Professor of Economic Geography at the London School of Economics and did the paper with Professor Christian Hilber, who's also at the LSE. And the report is part of a wider tax commission that Bright Blue has. It's a year-long commission involving a variety of cross-party, cross-sectoral individuals, including Dame Margaret Hodge, who's on the call today. And we're looking at various different areas of the tax system to have reform in the 2020s. So carbon, business, work and wealth tax, and also in property taxes. So today's paper is the first of that. And I must say as well that it's been made possible by the very generous support of Fairer Share and the Tax Commission itself. That's done in partnership with the Joffe Trust and Social Enterprise UK. For those of you who are tweeting, please use the hashtag HomeTruths. And if you want to ask a question to the panelists, then please do use the Slido link under the YouTube channel that you're watching at the moment. You can press on a hyperlink and then you can ask questions that way. So we'll now, after introducing the report that was published today, calling for a replacement to stamp duty and council tax after assessment of different options, we'll now hear from Kevin Hollenrake, MP, who is the chair of the Property Research Group of MPs. Over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Professor Cheshire, for this excellent body of work. Yes, Kevin Hollenrake, Member of Parliament for Thirsk and Malton, which is in North Yorkshire, and been in the property sector actually with my own business for 30 years prior to Parliament. But whenever I've stood in the 3 elections I've stood so far, my ticket, if you like, was a fairer society and a fairer deal for the North. Delighted that the government's really tackling the latter agenda, really, in terms of levelling up. But I think we also have the potential. It has to also mean a fairer society. That's what levelling up has to be. It's not just about regional equality. It's about a fairer deal for people on different incomes. And it has to be about prosperity. This isn't just about roads and railways and the shiny new job relocations of civil service. It has to be prosperity for the people who live in different parts of the country and different income circumstances. It has to be an improvement in their financial lot. And it's absolutely right, of course, that we're focusing in terms of levelling up around infrastructure, because we know that parts of the country, the Midlands, the North, the Southwest, have been left behind. And most of our infrastructure spending has been in London and the South East. And it's great to see that. And it's also great to see the job relocations and free ports and the rest of it. The trouble is, all that stuff is so long term. It just takes so long to level up the right way. It's the right thing to do it. But if you look at the relative disparity between average output, productivity, size of the economy, if you like, per capita, which the relative difference between London and the South East and the North East, the gap is, in relative terms, is as large as it was between East and West Germany prior to reunification. That took 30 years and $2 trillion to bring to narrow that gap to, and it's still not fully narrowed. So to actually achieve prosperity through all the stuff like infrastructure spending and other stuff, it's going to take a long time. So what other measures have we got at our disposal? Of course, the fastest, most instant way to level up, to build that prosperity in parts of the North and the Midlands and the like, is through fiscal measures, of course, looking principally the tax system. So it's pretty instant. And if you look, and that's why we've been really interested on the Property Research Group in looking at a proportional property tax. We've been looking at this for some time. Just the unfairness of the system. People say we don't want a wealth tax, but the reality is, as Professor Cheshire was saying, the whole system of council tax is based upon value anyway, but the real is so distorted at the moment, and so it's so much in favour of London versus parts of the rest of the country. For example, the average council taxpayer in London pays around 0.2% of their property value in tax every year, 0.7% on average in the North East. It's simply unfair. So if we're going to get that fairer society and a fairer deal for the North, we're going to have to do some radical thinking. And also, again, just endorse what Professor Cheshire said about stamp duty. Having been in the property game for 30 years, you know how that inhibits development, and it inhibits people moving from one house to another, which is very, very bad. That's a very poor tax, poor for the economy, poor for people's life chances in terms of people moving on. So that's got to be right for reform as well. And we've reformed it once. George Osborne reformed it once, of course, trying to make it fairer. But then you've got this again. You could easily argue it's made things worse. So certainly need to look at this in a completely different context, I think. So I very much welcome this report as it does that and proposes some really sensible solutions that we should consider. This has to be a debate. Of course, there'll be political pushback at this. Wealth taxes, for lots of people, particularly on my side of the fence, people will say this is a wealth tax. I don't believe it is a wealth tax, actually. It's a property tax, is what it is, based on the value of properties, just as council tax was supposed to be, of course. It does this in a different way. So it actually means everybody in every part of the country pays a similar amount based upon the value of their home. And I don't think we should either way completely reject something that's based on a value. Of course, business rates is a tax that is absolutely based upon a value of a property. So I don't think ideologically it should be a problem either. I do think politically it'll be difficult. There's no question about it. And I think that's why we need this kind of conversation. It's going to take time to move, to evolve the system even. No man, evolution is easier than revolution, and usually more successful, unless it has fewer unintended consequences. But nevertheless, I think it's hugely important we have this conversation. It's great that we've got Neil O'Brien, I think, who's the levelling up advisor in number 10. He proposed a different solution to this, but certainly looking at council tax in a report he did for Onward, certainly a change to the council tax system to make it fairer. So I think there is some political support for this, but there will be some resistance. I absolutely welcome the debate, welcome the conversation, and I think, like anything that is seen at first as being too politically difficult, it just needs the compelling case setting out, which I think has been set out today. It needs a coalition of people, cross-party, to look at this, and then it needs a lot of hard work and persistence to get this moving forward.
Great, thanks, Kevin. I mean, I understand the resistance coming from particular MPs who may feel that their constituents on average lose out in particular areas. But just thinking about the resistance that's coming from the Treasury, because the Treasury are quite sceptical of changes, particularly around stamp duty. And I'm just trying to understand what you feel is driving that resistance from the Treasury as an institution.
Well, Bill Shankly used to say before he sent his players out on the pitch, Liverpool manager, of course, most famous, the score's 0-0, don't let it get any worse. And I think so. The Treasury is always worried about changes because they've got stability, they've got growth happening at most of the time at a relatively stable level. And you make any big radical changes, unintended consequences may then apply. So that's one thing, and I completely understand that. This is potentially a very big change. So, and of course, Treasury ministers are political. Of course, this is politics. Applies to ministers like it applies to everybody else who's an elected politician. So there'll be worries about a backlash on this, and they'll be worried, as you say, about a certain cohort of MPs where their constituents are potentially worse off as a result of this. Some would argue they can afford it, but they'll be worried about particularly the certain people, certain types of individuals in certain types of properties being badly treated. I know the proportional property tax proposals that and a fair share came up with did deal with those kind of issues, like you capitalise extra payments in terms of this tax versus a council tax, for example, for people who are living singly in the later years in a large house, for example. So there are ways of mitigating those concerns, but I think it will need a fair bit of rolling of the pitch, which is a phrase I hate, but it's inevitable.
Great, thanks, Kevin, for your thoughts. We'll move now to Carol Lewis, who's the deputy property editor at the Times and the Sunday Times. Over to you, Carol.
Thank you. I mean, we've really seen in this last year the power that reform of taxes can have on the property market. I mean, the raising of the threshold for stamp duty has ignited the market, enabled lots of people to buy, move and invest. Stamp duty is no longer stymieing mobility, and it's unleashed a lot of cash into the wider economy, with each house bringing about £10,000 into the wider economy through, sort of decorators, removal men, and so on. And that's aside from the fees that the surveyors and estate agents take. The CPS predicted that abolition of stamp duty could bring a 46% increase in transactions, and by what we've seen, that could well be true. But we need to be careful because driving up transactions while supply is low causes the problem that we've got right now, which is vastly rising house prices. And they're actually rising, particularly in Wales and the north. So it's a reverse of the trend that we've seen since 1991, when values were set, as council tax values were set, as Paul said. So that's just something to be aware of if we're going to unleash this mobility, but we haven't sorted out the supply problem. As Paul said, stamp duty is currently skewed towards the south because that's where the more expensive homes are, while council tax tends proportionally to be skewed to the north, as Kevin has said. And this is partly because we haven't revalued since April 1991, and the prices in the south have risen disproportionately. I mean, the tide is turning slightly on house prices, but I mean, it's a long way to go before we see any uniformity across the country. So as it stands at the moment, people are paying in the south are paying more stamp duty, people in the north are proportionally paying more council tax. So the idea of scrapping both taxes and replacing them with a proportional annual tax seems fair. As Kevin said, I agree. It's been mooted several times over the years, and perhaps now is the time to act. And I think the suggestions made in this report are a good place to begin the debate, particularly like the linking to encouraging the green agenda and regeneration. There are a few pitfalls we need to look out for. How are we going to do the revaluing? Are people going to have to self-report improvement projects like large extensions and so on, the sort of things you can't see in the house price data so easily? There's going to be a huge number of appeals on revaluing. I mean, absolutely, particularly in the south. They're not going to like that at all. What are we going to say to those people who've recently paid very high stamp duty taxes, who are now going to rightly feel aggrieved by being hit by higher annual property taxes? You know, they might have an argument that that's not fair. And what about first-time buyers who traditionally build stamp duty into their mortgage borrowing, who now need to not put it in their mortgage borrowing, but budget for it on an annual basis, particularly in the south? So I'm behind the changes, behind the ideas. I really think it does need to be fairer. As Kevin said, though, it needs to be fairer across the country. Levelling up for the north cannot be levelling down for elsewhere.
Great stuff. Thank you, Carol. Paul, Carol raises some interesting points there. I was particularly thinking about valuation, and if people have made changes, modifications to their homes, what that means in terms of the accuracy of valuation. And the other is the transition to a new arrangement, because indeed, if someone has paid a big stamp duty bill in the last couple of years, and then suddenly they're now facing this new bill, how do you overcome that with your proposals?
Well, 2 points there, Ryan. First of all, remember that we are recommending that the local element of the APPT should be locally determined. So there's no necessary reason why people should be paying more to that in terms of their local contribution. And that is a much bigger proportion of the total tax burden than is the replacement of the stamp duty, which is really relatively small. It's 0.11% of the total. So the stamp duty, of course, would have that effect. But you might as well say that the stamp duty holiday we're presently in is unfair because suddenly people aren't paying stamp duty. It happens that they're actually probably paying a bigger premium on their houses than they would have done for the stamp duty, but that's another issue. What was your second point? So, how do you valuation? I mean, Kevin may not like this, but as an economist, you can value houses using statistical methods literally overnight. You could do the whole British housing stock overnight, and it's not free. I mean, that's what the big data scrapers like Rightmove and Zoopla do all the time, and they're pretty accurate. Of course, you have to have a human factor, so you have to have an appeals system to let people argue their case. But I've been doing what's called hedonic modelling of house prices now for 35 years, and my results are far more accurate than those of professional valuers. Sorry about that, Kevin. So it's not a problem. I
entirely agree with you, Paul. I entirely agree with you. Not at all. No, of course.
And the other thing, of course, is that you make a big change to the physical structure of your house. Now, because of the terrible shortage of housing and the price of land, in fact, the physical condition of a house makes remarkably little difference to its value. It's much more a question of where the house is.
Great, thank you, Paul. Okay, we'll now move to the Right Honourable Dame Margaret Hodge MP, who was former chair of the Public Accounts Committee and also is now chair of the APPG on responsible taxation.
Thanks, Ryan. Well, I'm here at a sort of conservative-led think tank because I do think that if we're going to have major tax reforms, they're more likely to work and they're more likely to be sustained if we can get cross-party consensus. And it's also, I think, much easier to get public buy-in to difficult reforms, again, if you can build a cross-party consensus in Parliament. And remember, even on this reform, there will be 1 in 4 of the people affected will be losers. So that's quite important to try and build that. And I also agree that the current system is completely broken. I was a minister when Nick Rainsford did try and fix it in I'm trying to think when it was. It must have been 2008, 2007, 2008. And the government bottled it. And that is really the record of successive governments of all colours, particularly in relation to property tax foundation. And I also agree with Paul's analysis in his report that the present system is both regressive and unfair, and that if you're in a low value house, you pay a high council tax. If you're in a high value house, you pay a low tax. And I've taken my constituency as an example. It's not true that the whole of London is the same, Kevin. Barking and Dagenham, we're the 21st most deprived borough in the country, and yet the council tax, the category D council tax bill is £1,198, nearly £1,200. Kensington and Chelsea, another London borough, which is 118 out of the 317 local authorities, it's £865. So in the poorer borough, they're paying a third more than Kensington and Chelsea. And then look at Hartlepool, which was in the news, 10th most deprived borough in the whole country, and they pay over £2,000 each, 2.25 times more than they do in Kensington and Chelsea. So it is inequitable. So I'm really keen to look at these proposals in detail. I like the sort of direction of travel, but I hope you'll also take the questions I've still got and the issues I raise, take them seriously, and perhaps come back in as part of the debate. I think the first thing is about local authority funding. Paul said it, taxing property is there to fund local authority services, to provide the resources to fund local authority services. And what you don't, if you care about levelling up, you've got to ensure that the reforms you make aren't just fairer between individuals who pay the tax, but become fairer between areas. So areas can afford to provide the services, levelling up those areas where the need is greatest and where the intervention of the public sector, be it in education or social care or whatever, could make the greatest difference to levelling up living standards. And you don't touch the whole issue of central government contribution and central government's role in providing those resources. And I think you need to, particularly because it's all got into such a mess. In the mid sort of 80s, about half of local authority spending was covered by central government grant. That's been cut dramatically, and under the austerity period, we had a 38% real terms cut in grant. But what's worse is that the decisions that have been taken mean that the slicing of that smaller cake has affected the poor areas more than it has the richer areas. So actually, we've gone in reverse from levelling up. And if you look at the IFS figures on this, spending per person in the most deprived 10th of council areas has gone down by an average of 31%, compared to spending in the areas of cuts in the least deprived 10% of areas, it's 16%. So it's half the cuts in the least deprived. So any change that you bring in or think about has got to address government's role, has got to address equalisation, and has got to address fairness between areas. And I have to say, a bit of an oddity in this scheme is proposing giving money back to central government when they've taken so much money out of local government. Seems to me, I think local authorities will go ballistic if you do that. The second thing I wanted to say is the principle of localisation. Paul talked about this, and I think localisation is common ground. And I suppose my argument there is around your development levy and the government's proposed infrastructure levy, because I think, I can't quite understand why you all think 106 is such a mess. It is a locally determined way of trying to ensure that developers who make a contribution, who make money out of developing in an area should contribute back. And that has to be negotiated locally, not determined centrally where the money should go. You've got to enable that to be spent locally according to local priorities and needs. I think the other thing I have a little bit of problems with is what I think is lying behind your analysis of the housing market. Somehow stamp duty reform will release a fantastic increase in housing in housing development. We're suddenly going to get magically lots more homes, but the housing market isn't a perfect market. I'm sure Carol's the great expert on this, and simply releasing forms into the owner-occupied sector will not of itself deal with the real problem we've got of a decent home at a price they can afford to the people at the bottom of the pile. And again, if you're interested in levelling up, I'm not sure this does very much. In fact, one of my fears about your proposals, and I don't know whether you've thought this through, is if it all goes on the valuation, a contemporary and kept up-to-date valuation of property, which I think is a very attractive concept, you might get into the position where you should have some social engineering and sort of socio-economic ghettos emerge, because people who will move to areas where property prices are lower and therefore the tax will be lower. Whereas at the moment, that doesn't happen because of the interaction of the council tax system and the benefit system. So you don't necessarily have these socio-economic ghettos, which I don't think are very healthy for a cohesive society. The other thing is you haven't addressed the issue. You've addressed a lot of taxes. Nothing has been said about the bedroom tax. So if we're going to look at property taxation in the round, why are we not talking about the bedroom tax? And I do think we have to think about the interaction of this new tax with all the traditional council tax reliefs and how that will work not only to ensure that nobody is disadvantaged either as individuals or areas, but also to ensure that the changes don't impact on the poorest. And finally, and this is perhaps a little bit odd coming from me, when I think about tax reform, I always think simplicity is absolutely the rule. And I think, Paul, you make that point in your argument. And there are fantastic things we all want to introduce into the tax system to meet our sort of values. And you introduce, and there are two things you do for empty houses, and you do one for the green agenda. But that immediately introduces some complexity. And I always recoil a little bit. I think if you're going to keep it simple, keep it simple. So, but I can understand the debate. But if you go to a complexity, go for something that Kevin and I jointly work on together. And that is what we ought to be using this as an opportunity to try and actually deal with money laundering, where much of the money comes into the property market in the UK. And you could do something punitive around APPT rates where properties are owned by foreigners or foreign-based companies or something like that. So you might go for simplicity, which I think I might be the one I would go for. I think I'd pursue my other agenda elsewhere. But if you're going to add little bits in, please put something in around money laundering and property. So that's it. Those are some of my ideas as I first read the report. I do think it's an interesting debate. I think it's a move in the right direction. I would love to see really cross-party support for this concept as it evolves, but I think you have to take the wider view that I've probably reflected with a greater interest in people to pay in the progressive nature of taxation wherever it is. I think all taxes, Paul, should be progressive.
Great, thank you, Margaret. Typically very forensic and lots of questions and challenges there, which is great. And it's good that everybody has read the report so forensically as well, because sometimes when you spend hours poring over finer sentences, you don't know if people are reading it, but they really are. So that's fantastic. Paul, maybe just, I mean, there's lots of challenges there, but just one thing that I'd like you just to pick up, because I've heard other people talk about this, which is the development levy which you're proposing as a replacement to Section 106 agreements and the community infrastructure levy, a sense that this is kind of nationally determined, and so you're taking away kind of local elements away from the system, and that's what Margaret was referring to as well. Do you have anything to say about that?
Lots to say about it, Ryan. You'd be surprised to discover. Well, first thing, just quickly, we are very clearly trying to re-establish a division between what should be national priorities funded out of national taxation, which for me would include certainly education, but would also include levelling up specific measures like improving training and education opportunities in more deprived areas. So that's a central point. We're saying that this should just be, we should separate out those services which really are for the local community to decide. And those should be the ones that are funded out of local taxation. With respect to the infrastructure levy, Section 106, I mean, I've been working on this for 25 years. Section 106 agreements, which are these complex negotiations between developers and local authorities about what the conditions of giving development rights will be, are not a second best tax on land value uplift. They're about 122nd best tax. They are appallingly inefficient. They are inefficient for two major reasons, or three major reasons. One is because they privilege bigger developers. Bigger developers are much more effective at negotiating them, and there are big fixed costs in engaging with the process. So if you talk to a really big developer, they'll say Section 106 agreements are great. But if you look at what's happened to the structure of the development industry, small developers have been squeezed out, and we have an increasingly monopolized sector, which is partly because of the complexity of the whole planning system, but particularly the complexity of Section 106 agreements. And the second thing is that they introduce additional uncertainty. I remember being present at a committee meeting in what was then, I think at that moment, called the Department of Communities and Local Government, where we were looking at Section 106 agreements and whether one should free up Section 106 agreements for small developments. And there was a smaller developer. The only time I've ever been on a government committee where you actually had smaller firms represented, who was very articulate and just said, you know, for us, it's appalling. We have to try and price out the agreement, and we have to get finance from the banks. We can't price out the agreement and do a cash flow modelling until we know what the Section 106 agreement is going to be. And we don't discover that until about 3 days before the committee meets. And then we have to scurry around to arrange the finances, because the value of the development cannot be determined until you know what the Section 106 agreement is. And that introduces uncertainty. Now, if you introduce uncertainty, as any economist will tell you, this means that you get a bigger risk premium. So developments that otherwise would be viable are not viable simply because of the extra risk that's involved, because you don't know what the Section 106 agreement will be before you actually do it. So Section 106 agreements are really bad. And anyway, they're only charged by about half of local authorities. And look at the data. And they're worth charging on big developments because of the fixed costs of negotiating them. So having a transparent levy, which will be reflected in land prices, it will be capitalized back into land prices. If developers know they're going to have to pay 20% extra, which will be a revenue to the local authority, then it just means that they'll pay less for the land. You'll have a transition problem, but it's not a very big problem if you talk to developers. So that gives you a transparent and very large amount of money. I mean, you're talking of billions of pounds a year in terms of the revenue that would generate, which I think should be partly within the control of the local authority, but also should be allowing the development to take place. It should be therefore offsetting for the NIMBY pressures, because one of the reasons people oppose local developments is because they know that their roads are going to get more congested, their schools will become more full and more difficult. There will be problems, but they don't get any revenue to offset for them. So it's a way of, the major problem with housing affordability is simply we don't build enough houses. If you look at the last 30 years, we've built nearly 4 million fewer houses than we built in the previous 30 years. And we don't build enough houses because our system has simply become dysfunctional and moribund, and it needs to be simplified greatly. And so to provide incentives for local communities to accept new homes is one, it's only a small measure, to improve it. Another small measure, and I agree with you, it's only a small measure, would be to get a better use of the housing space we have available by meaning that people who are more willing to sell houses that no longer suit them, and young expanding families are more able to buy houses that do suit them. I agree, it's a very small part of the solution, but it's a part of it, contributes to the solution, whereas at the moment it's contributing to make the problem even worse.
Okay, very passionate and eloquent. You could go on all day, Paul, but
I'll try not to, Ryan.
So we're running out of time. So finally, we'll go to the final speaker. And just to remind people, I am getting questions through, but you can ask questions to panelists through Slido, which is beneath the YouTube screen that you're watching. So finally, to Andrew Dixon, who is the founder and chair of Fairer Share.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Bright Blue. And thank you. I'm really delighted that your tax commission chose property tax reform to be your first piece of work. So thank you. And obviously, thank you to Professor Cheshire for your excellent paper. Really is an excellent read, covers so much great material. Really endorse your comments, but also the comments of our guest speakers earlier today. I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion. And, as founder of Fairer Share, I've got a lot of feedback from our supporters up and down the country. 120,000 households have signed a petition calling for reform. And it's very clear that council tax is a de facto wealth tax for many on low and middle income incomes. I think it's a real challenge for them, has a real impact on their disposable income. But I think for those living in sort of larger properties, council tax is really a mere service charge. So I personally believe that households are already paying sufficient property taxes, but they're paying taxes at the wrong times, and in the wrong locations. So in this regard, I think Bright Blue's paper, I think, is really the Goldilocks of property tax reform, and completely thank Professor Cheshire for his paper. Just want to talk a little bit about the politics of levelling up. It's clearly, a policy item from which the Conservative Party have been elected, and I think we're all committed to bringing about meaningful change for parts of the country that have often missed out on investment, particularly in the North and the Midlands. And these areas have the highest council tax burden, as Margaret has already alluded to. Underinvested areas are often less able to raise funds locally, which means they're very dependent on council tax. So, for example, we take Hartlepool or Easington. On average, they pay something like 20 to 25 times the rate of council tax relative to the property value when compared to, say, the likes of Westminster and Kensington. And I think that sort of very much goes against the sort of British sense of fairness that Kevin was talking about. So definitely, like a lot of what Professor Cheshire has recommended, I think the element of this is in many ways a tax cut for those in the regions, I think is really vitally important. And this goes pounds in the pockets, which is money that can be spent on the high street, helping to boost local economies and level up those areas. I think the cross-party support is absolutely vital, and I think Margaret is spot on to highlight that. I think there is hope. I think under the sort of current electoral system and obviously the outcome of Brexit, the 2019 general election, we have new voter coalitions in which the North and the Midlands are the battleground seats, which means politically it should be possible to build some cross-party support. And at Fairer Share, we've been very grateful for the support of 8 Conservative Party MPs and 8 Labour MPs who support our work for a proportional property tax, which I think is really encouraging. We've also had constructive discussions with the Liberal Democrats and the Green Party, who support similar reforms. And we're really, really grateful for our engagement with the media. We've had supportive editorials and op-eds from both the right and the left-leaning press. So, yeah, absolutely, I do think there is the opportunity to bring about sort of reform, but it does need to be on a cross-party basis. I guess the next and final point on my side is just how we sort of build that political momentum for property tax reform. Kevin's spot on, it will be politically challenging, but I think Professor Cheshire's paper is very timely. I think a few things jump out to me. Obviously highlights the benefits of proportionality, which I think chimes with the fairness argument. It shows the challenges around valuation are eminently surmountable, and we've done a 200-page paper on this, which can demonstrate how other countries have managed to do it. I think particularly in a country like the UK, which prides itself on AI and data analytics, there's no reason why we can't value properties. I like the green offsets. I think that's very innovative. And I think that Paul's made a very sort of clear case that there's no technical reasons why we can't bring about reform. My fear, I have to admit, is that given how well they're doing in the polls, the government will probably do the bare minimum to level up. And I think, again, that perhaps chimes a little bit with Kevin's comments around Bill Shankly. We do need to build momentum around the government's central policy of levelling up. And I think with this in mind, I think there is a real opportunity to engage with Neil O'Brien and his levelling up white paper, which I think is due out in autumn. I do hope Neil's work will address issues of inequality around both the regional and the intergenerational piece, because I think we tend to focus a little bit or a lot on the regional element, but the intergenerational piece is really important too. And I think, Professor Cheshire highlights that in his paper. So we're really excited. I think, it is ripe for reform. We're very grateful for the engagement with Carol at the Times, Russell Lynch at the Telegraph, Daniel Martin at the Daily Mail, Martin Wolf at the FT. I think they all recognise the need for reform. And as Margaret and Kevin have already mentioned, local government finance, council tax and stamp duty are ready and ripe for that change. So I do think we need to build a sort of broad church of supporters. I think they can be parliamentarians, grassroots movements like Fairer Share, thought leaders in the media like Carol, think tanks like Bright Blue, IPPR, etc., and various charities who are very sort of passionate around the work in this area. So I think we all have to play a part in this and putting pressure on the government. I think it will take time, as we've discussed. But I think it's a cause that is well worth supporting. My team at Fairer Share will certainly be doing our part, and I just hope that we can build a property tax system that we can all be proud of. And as Kevin says, let's try and build a fairer society. So thank you, Ryan. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Great stuff. Thank you, Andrew. What I'm going to do, because I'm conscious of time, is bring in the questions. So I've got lots coming through. So I'm going to just take 3 and I'm going to direct them to particular panelists. So an anonymous person, hopefully it's not the chief whip, Kevin, has said, do you think proportional property tax would have any effect on property prices? So perhaps I can direct that to Carol first. And then the second one, which I'll probably direct to Paul, that is from Andrew Purves, who asks, is your proposal revenue neutral? Shifting taxation from production and consumption onto a movable property is considered by many to be more efficient. And then a third question, which could be to anybody, is from Jack Coates, who has asked, so why not go purely for a land value tax or site value rating? It's easier to value, easier to adjust when local changes improve desirability. So perhaps I could start with you, Carol, just on what you think the effect may be on property prices.
There's two ways it could go, Ryan. One is if people move to the lower tax areas, as Margaret was saying, then you're going to push the prices up in those areas. So then conversely, they don't remain lower tax areas because your property prices will start pushing up. So it could skew things around in that way. But it depends, because it's also, you can't just look at one side of the equation. So yes, people may want to move and they may want to move to different areas than they do now, but that's a lot dependent on jobs and so on. That might happen. It might push property prices up in certain areas. But if, as Paul has said, might happen, if it encourages development and we sort out the supply problems, then the impact on pricing shouldn't be as hard. So there's two sides to the equation and we have to look at both. Does that answer the question in any way?
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Yeah. Kevin, maybe you want to come in particularly around this land value tax point.
Yes, I'm happy to. Just on that property prices thing, I hope so. I mean, you've got runaway property prices in some part of the country. I don't think that's a good thing or a sustainable thing. What you're trying to get is moderate prices right across the country in terms of sensible growth, because lots of the problems with affordability in the UK it's not the same everywhere. So affordability issues are much bigger issues in parts of London and South East than they are in parts of the North East, for example. So, and you probably noticed that New Zealand, they're looking to get their own monetary policy committee and now looking at house prices in terms of that being one of the measures that they're looking to moderate over time. So I hope it would mean property prices do become fairer throughout the country. Land value tax, I've looked at this several times and Andrew's done some work on it as well. I just worry about unintended consequences with that. It is a pretty complex thing. What proportional property tax is and the other measures that Paul is suggesting, it is a very simple proposition that you can, of course, there'll be some unintended consequences, but you can kind of guess what they would be. Well, I think it's, if that makes any sense, but I think land value tax is much more difficult to do that. I think it's a much bigger revolution. So I think this is simpler and easier to implement.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts on an LVT?
Yeah, and funnily enough, actually, before looking at residential, we looked at business rates, and we did manage to do a paper on LVT applying it to business rates. But for residential, it was really quite challenging because of land values in London. You'd end up having to have thresholds to support people in certain parts of London. That would make it a lot more complex. And I completely agree with Margaret around simplicity. I think the second element for us comes in with the politics. With our campaign, we recognise this is grassroots. We needed a campaign that was easy to understand to address the political challenges. And that's why we based on property values. It takes people 20 seconds to find out the value of their property on Zoopla. That makes it a lot easier to engage with households up and down the country, rather than trying to explain to them how they might be able to go away and value their land. So for us, to address the political challenges, we wanted to have a very much a retail campaign, and that's why we avoided LVT. But I do love LVT, but it's not an argument for today, I don't think.
Okay, yeah, very fair point. Paul, this question from Andrew Purves about your proposals being revenue neutral. I remember doing the editing with you and it was rather complex, but maybe you want to answer that.
Well, the whole point, and this sort of also comes back to the point that Margaret raised, the whole point of the stamp duty replacement is that if you can't replace the stamp duty, which is a big chunk of revenue for the Treasury will absolutely veto reform. You have to do it, whether you like it or not. And what we're proposing is an absolutely revenue neutral replacement of the lost revenue from stamp duty. The rest of it, the local APT, we cannot say whether it's revenue neutral or not, because our argument is that local authorities should be free to charge their own local rate, and we don't know what that will be and I would suspect that if local authorities really become sort of empowered to raise their own revenues, which they're not at the moment, probably they will tend to raise a little bit more revenue and provide rather better and more local services, particularly given how stretched they've been by cuts over the last 20 years. And that would be not revenue neutral, that would increase revenue, but it would do so on land and property, which, as economists for generations have argued, is the most efficient way of raising taxes without distorting incentives and people's behaviour.
Great. I'm going to take a couple more questions now from the audience. So the first is from Adam, who says, how would you convince those that would likely pay more under the proportional property tax that it is fairer and to support it? Maybe Margaret, you want to come in on that, but I'll come to another question as well, which is from Sam Demetriou, who asks, how will the development levy, which is proposed in the paper, work for high cost builds, e.g. brownfield land that needs to be treated first? Yeah, and then I've got another question here, which is an anonymous question, which is saying, how can we use council tax revaluations and discounts to incentivize consumers to invest in green improvements? So obviously the paper talks about how we do, how we have kind of green offsets, but I suppose more broadly, how can, changes to the property tax system, whether it's this or just council tax revaluations or changes to stamp duty, how can that support the net zero agenda and support people to retrofit their homes? Because obviously there's been a lot of policy failure in that area with the Green Homes Grant and the Green Deal not working. So 3 questions there. So firstly, maybe to Margaret, if I could go to you. You're on mute, Margaret.
I'm on mute. There we are. Apologies, because I'm going to have to go pretty promptly at 3:15. Really, really sorry about that. I mean, I just want to come back a bit. This ought to be the beginning of the debate, because I don't think Paul gets, if you've got high need areas with low yield because the properties are valued less, you're going to end up with a higher rate, because the high need means more services. And therefore, the attempt to get a fairer system across the country won't work, which brings me back to my first point, is you have to see this in the context of the totality of support and funding for local authorities. You can't just see it as a tax-based way of funding. You can't run away from that. I think most people, I think you get to the fairer bit if you can convince most people, if you can get cross-party consensus. I really do believe that. And then we can both, it's a bit like social care. You know, we all know we're going to have to all pay a little bit into the system. Every time one party raises it, the other party launches in an attack in one way or another. And until you can get everybody talking from the same hymn sheet, you'll never get the reforms that we need. So I genuinely think the cross-party consensus is hugely important. I mean, I don't want to now talk to Paul about the development levy, because he feels passionately. I feel passionately the other way, but maybe that's a conversation that we can have elsewhere. And the final thing on the green offsets, I just really worry, if I can say this, and this is, Ryan, a general thing for all the work that you're doing, I really worry about using one tax to achieve another objective. I really worry that it leads to all sorts of unintended consequences. You see that all the way through with every single tax relief or tax incentive that we've got in our broader tax system. So I would keep this as simple as possible. And there are other ways in which we can achieve our zero carbon targets without having to try and muddy the waters and think about the green agenda, when we're actually thinking about the funding of local authorities and how use the property base as a way of funding that.
Great, thank you very much, Margaret. I'm very grateful for your time. Yeah, no,
right. Can I just, sorry.
Yes, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Really interesting points. Can I just come back, because I have to go as well, actually, but on the local authority funding of local authorities. Local authority funding is a complete mess already. It's all about top-ups and tariffs. It's not. We were talking about local revenue collection, council tax, business rates. We went through this on the select committee. There's very little evidence, in fact, no evidence that there's any correlation between incentives for local authorities to build houses, to put more office space and business premises up to get more revenue. Really, it was because they were all washed away with the system. But when you did recalculations every few years, they went away anyway. So the whole system is based on top-ups and tariffs. So the key thing is collecting the right amount of money in a fair way, and then redistributing it fairly according to need. Exactly what you're saying. I think we're too focused on local revenue generation, because that just doesn't work. Because as you correctly say, the need does not correlate with the mechanisms for raising the revenue.
Carol, perhaps I can ask you to come in on any of the questions that were asked, perhaps the kind of broader fairness point, but also, you know, is it right to use property tax to try and achieve goals around net zero?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I thought it was actually a good idea. I know it's one that's been suggested before by Reba to tie property tax with the EPC. But I do take what Margaret's saying. It could make it complicated. I mean, I know tax can be very complicated. I just think it has to be front and center. Otherwise, people aren't going to be taking notice. So I would say I do want it there on, you know, weighing it up. I can see that it makes it more complex, but I think it needs to be front and center whenever anyone thinks about their property. And the EPC is the only time anyone does. So I think it does need to be in some way incorporated into the sort of seller's pack, or that's been discussed, or the way that we think about our properties.
Andrew.
Yeah, just wanted to pick up on the how we sort of bring a broad church as supporters, even those who might end up paying more. I mean, I don't think British people have a problem paying tax. I think they have a problem when they find out that some people are paying a much higher or much lower rate than they are. I think that's where people get that's what really grinds their gears in many ways. So I think, that fairness argument has got to be, upright, front and central. I think the other element is those who will pay more, the older generations, and I think they're battling at the moment with how their children, their grandchildren will be able to buy a property or move up the housing ladder. So I think there's lots of ways that these issues can be framed. One can introduce the cap. For example, we at Fairer Share have a cap of £1,200 increase to smooth the burden, make it easier. Obviously, that cap goes away when the property is sold, because obviously they're not paying stamp duty, and therefore they move to the rate of, we have 0.48%. But I think there's lots of compelling arguments. This is all about the political will. I don't think British people at all will have a problem with paying their fair share. And, that resonates very much with our supporters. Lots of people have said, listen, I'd like to find a way to pay more because I don't think I'm doing my bit. And that resonates up and down the country.
Great. And then final comments from the report's co-author, Paul. Perhaps you want to reflect, and particularly Sam Dimitri's question around the development levy for high cost builds, if you want to mention that specific point, but before zooming out slightly. You're on mute, Paul. So
no, I've just unmuted myself, but successfully muted myself. So just very quickly on the complexity point, I agree with Margaret's reservations about having a system that's more complex. But first of all, the system as a whole is orders of magnitude less complex and more transparent than that which exists at the moment. You can hardly imagine a system more opaque and random than council taxes. So I think that on balance, it's going to be a simplification. And I just point to the argument about parking, residence parking permits, the cost of residence parking permits and emissions. I pay a residence permit charge, which is conditional on how clean my car is. It's just taken as part of the deal. And I think people would get used to doing that with their houses. And the advantage of it being built in to the tax they pay on an annual basis is that they'll think about the energy efficiency of their house every year and they'll upgrade it. It'll be an ongoing incentive to make changes. With respect to the development levy, well, yes, first off, the development levy, just like Section 106 agreements, just like community infrastructure levy, will be negatively capitalised into land prices. That happens at the moment with those other things. It would happen with the development levy. So possibly there would be some sites that would not be viable. But if they're not viable with a development levy, then I think the evidence very clearly shows they wouldn't be viable now with the Section 106 and the SIL issues, which are just basically the same. But the development levy is much more transparent. It's easier to forecast. It takes uncertainty out of the development process. So I think it will get more development will be viable. And in fact, you'll tend to have more challenging sites developed with it than you do at present without it, because you've got the additional uncertainty of the Section 106 agreements.
Great stuff. Incredibly rich and detailed discussion, and good to see a kind of consensus emerging. And as a lot of the speakers have said, I think if we're going to achieve real reform, we need that cross-party support, and that's started to emerge today, and I hope we can continue it. As Margaret said, let's carry on the conversation. If you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag #HomeTruths and keep asking questions. Let's keep interacting over the report. You can find the full report on our website. A thanks again to Fairer Share for partnering with us on the event and the report. We're very grateful, and thank you to Joffe Trust and Social Enterprise UK for supporting our overall tax commission project. And this is, as I said at the start, this is the first paper of many more to come. Big thank you to the speakers for their time and their thoughts, and particular thanks to Paul, who has produced a really thorough and excellent report. So have a good afternoon, everybody, and hope to see you again soon.